So today, what I thought we'd do is focus broadly on the topic of prejudice and bias, and specifically how we as leaders can ensure that we're catching, really catching up our bias tendencies when they occur, so we're not demonstrating bias at work, and for that matter, in any aspect of our lives. So I'm going to hand over to Jen, and Jen's going to help us consider what bias actually is and how is a bias formed. So over to you, Jen.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Well, according to psychology, a bias is a tendency, inclination, or prejudice toward or against something or someone. And really, there are too many different types of bias to cover them all today in our short time. So some biases are positive and helpful, like choosing to only eat healthy foods or staying away from someone who has knowingly accused harm. But biases are often based on stereotypes rather than actual knowledge of an individual or circumstance. So whether positive or negative, these sort of cognitive shortcuts can result in prejudgments or assumptions that lead to rash decisions or discriminatory practices. And the thing is, no one is without bias, no matter how well intentioned. And on the positive side, bias has served us as an evolutionary advantage for us humans. Think saber-toothed tiger outside the cave. And our biases are formed at a very young age, often as a result of our upbringing and the views, beliefs, and actions of our family and close friends, as well as our institutions and the media. So bias is learned. At the individual level, bias can negatively impact someone's personal and professional relationships. And at a societal level, it can lead to unfair persecution of a group and the damaging and traumatic consequences that come with that, as has been highlighted this past week. So what does this mean when we pull it back to us as individuals? Well, for those of you who like neuroscience, neuropsychologist Marwa Azab says that although we human beings may arrogantly believe that we are in control of all of our thoughts and actions, research has clearly shown otherwise. That's because we have both logical and reflexive brain networks. The logical one requires time and energy, whereas the reflexive one doesn't. So because it's easier to use the reflexive one, we're mostly on autopilot. And that leads to thinking about implicit or unconscious bias. That's the bias that underpins your behavior and interactions that you're not even conscious of. So we think and act without conscious thought a lot more than we'd like to believe. So how do we manage our bias as leaders and act more consciously and with less discrimination? According to Psychology Today, telling people to suppress prejudice often has the opposite effect. When people are trained to notice prejudice or biased thoughts without trying to push them away, they're able to make a deliberate choice about how they behave towards others as a result. And this can lead to less discrimination and reduced bias over time. So Anna, can you take us through an exercise to uncover implicit bias when leading teams?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jen. So here's a little challenge for each of you to work on this coming week. So I want you to think about all your team members. Okay, and one thing I wanted to add is that we're going to have a little guide sheet that will run you through this process. So just absorb it for now. And at the end of the session, we'll be sharing the resources with you so you can walk this through step by step. So for each of your team members, write down 3 positive thoughts that you have about them and 3 negative thoughts. Okay, just what you're thinking about them right now. And maybe you could just hold someone in your mind right now and quickly run that through. What are 3 positive things I think about that team member and 3 negative things that I might think? And just check in, are you weighted towards the positive or the negative? What do you notice? And this is kind of like our alarm bells for leaders, like leaders beware. What could be at play here is what we call confirmation bias. And that's when you believe something about a person or your situation, and then your brain unconsciously looks for the confirming evidence. So that, oh, I knew I was right all along, that kind of thing. So if you think someone in your team is a slacker, you're going to be scanning the environment for all the ways that that person demonstrates that you were right and they are a slacker, even if there is disconfirming evidence that would prove you wrong. Okay, we don't like to be wrong. So interesting to know that confirmation bias can go both ways. So, and you might even have come across this in recruitment. You can have the halo effect or the horns effect. So halo effect is you really like one aspect of the person's character or behavior. And so what you do is you generalize, you unconsciously focus on that and you generalize it to the whole person. So everything about that person is good. The halo is shining the whole time. Or you can have the opposite. You can have the horns effect, and that's one thing is off, whatever that might be. And then you generalize that to characterize the person as all bad, right? So they don't stand a chance with you. So interesting to notice what we're doing. So we highly recommend that you make the time, reflection, you know how we love reflection, to consider each member of your team. And it'll likely be more subtle than that halo horns example that we just gave you, but so you'll need to really apply yourself and look deeply at your tendencies and your automatic thoughts, what you think about the person straight off the bat. Once you've done that, then we want you to think for the next week whether you're weighted more to the positive or the negative, or even perhaps you think you're neutral, and challenge yourself to see each team member through a fresh set of eyes. Hard to do, right? So look for that disconfirming evidence. Prove yourself wrong, okay? So maybe there's a development opportunity for someone that you think is perfect, has the halo going on. Or maybe there's an appreciation due for someone that you think maybe you've put the horns on, okay? So the point of this here is to really step back, get back on my balcony that I'm always talking about, and take a fresh perspective and see what you discover, okay? So a little exercise that everybody can run through. So Jen, what else should leaders look out for when they're kind of exploring, these biases they might hold?
Yeah, well, there's something sneaky, Anna, we all do in our reflection on self and others called attribution bias. And let's take that example of the team member that we've labeled a slacker. Maybe I labeled him that because the last few tasks I've delegated to him, he's either completed late or done a subpar job. And I even had a chat and asked if things were okay, and he didn't mention anything wrong. So I automatically assumed the problem must be attributed to a character flaw, in this case, laziness. And this kind of cognitive bias is called a fundamental attribution error. And interestingly, it's our human tendency when assessing others to commonly attribute their faults or mistakes to who they are as a person, rather than external or situational factors impacting them. And curiously, we do the opposite when it comes to ourselves. So the self-serving bias happens when we attribute our faults or mistakes to external factors, not our character, to protect our self-esteem. So going back to the slacker example, let's say my boss pointed out to me that I hadn't been giving development opportunities or support to my direct report. I'd more likely attribute my shortcoming to being too busy or some other external factor. I'd be unlikely to attribute my lack of support to my being a slacker of a boss. So this reminds me of one of my favorite Einstein quotes. He said, "We see the world as we are, not as it is." So if you'd like to further enhance your self-reflection and develop your awareness, you can take a 10-minute assessment from Project Implicit at Harvard University. And we'll put the link on our resource page along with the exercise and when we post today's recording. And I think, guys, the takeaway in all this is that we can lessen our bias and discrimination. We can do it by committing to the next level of self-reflection as leaders and standing firmly in a growth mindset. And this means being willing to look more deeply at how our unconscious beliefs and biases drive our behavior and our interactions with others. And remember, awareness is the first step to taking action and change. All right, Anna, back to you.
We're talking about prejudice and bias and things like that. And of course, lots of organizations have spent lots and lots of money doing this stuff called diversity training. Doesn't seem to be working so well. What the hell is going on there, Jen?
Yes, well, I'm sure there's some positives coming from it, but overall, as we see in the world, there's more work to be done. And neuroscientists, or a neuroscientist whose work I was looking at, was claiming that, as I was talking about earlier, because so much of our bias is at the non-conscious or unconscious level, the workshops and things that we provide, they really target the logical brain, but it's the non-conscious implicit brain that drives biased behavior and action. So this neuroscience is calling for our programs to target more that non-conscious and not rely so much on the logical.
Nice one. It takes me back to that lovely learning model about, unconsciously incompetent. So we think we've got this whole bias thing covered, and actually, what, we don't even know what we're doing. So it's kind of what's under the surface. So really encourage you all to kind of take that little test that we're going to share in the resource link, because it's just a fascinating insight into yourself, another level of reflection. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a big project at Harvard, and it's for all sorts of different types of bias, and you can choose which one you want to do, or as many as you want to do.
Well, again, time has flown. We'll be back to you live again next week with another exciting installment. Thank you so much for joining us today. Lovely to see your faces, and we'll talk. Bye for now.
Take care, everyone.